A doctor in 1840s Vienna figured out that washing his hands could stop women from dying in childbirth. The medical establishment's response? They dismissed him, mocked him, and eventually locked him in an asylum, where he died of the exact infection he'd spent his career trying to prevent. That's not the strangest part of this story, though. The strangest part is what ancient people were already doing, thousands of years before anyone knew germs existed at all. Here's the assumption to get out of the way immediately. Ancient people did wash their hands. Romans did it before meals as an unquestioned social norm, the way you'd buckle a seatbelt today. Egyptians washed regularly with a soap made from animal fat and plant ash. Islamic tradition built ritual hand-washing into religious law over 1,400 years ago, arguably the most consistently practiced hygiene program in human history. Jewish law required washing at multiple specific points in the day, with dedicated blessings attached, so the real question isn't whether they washed, it's why. Because the reasons had nothing to do with germs, and that gap between practice and understanding is where this entire story gets interesting. The idea that invisible particles could jump from a sick person to a healthy one isn't intuitive at all. It's honestly remarkable anyone worked it out before microscopes existed. Before germ theory took hold in the late 1800s, the dominant explanation for disease almost everywhere was miasma theory, bad air, specifically the stench from rot, sickness, and pollution, caused illness. This wasn't a stupid theory. It correctly predicted where disease clustered, near swamps, sewage, and crowded unventilated spaces. It just got the mechanism completely wrong. And because the logic ran through smell rather than direct contact, hand-washing specifically never got the elevated status it holds in medicine today. You washed because you smelled bad, because it was expected, because religious law demanded it. That it also interrupted the transmission of actual pathogens was, from where anyone stood at the time, a complete accident. Religious ritual purity deserves real credit here, because it quietly drove more hand-washing behavior across history than anything resembling medical reasoning. Jewish Tuma law required washing after specific categories of contact, before eating, after using the toilet. Islamic wudu required washing hands, face, and feet before prayer. Hindu ritual bathing, Buddhist monastic hygiene codes precise enough that historians credit them with lower disease transmission in monasteries. None of these practices were understood as germ prevention. They were spiritual maintenance. But the physical result, regular washing that happened to strip away pathogens, was identical either way. It's one of the strangest cases in medical history, a practice that worked for thousands of years, before anyone understood why it worked, and understanding the mechanism later didn't make the practice more effective. It just changed the justification attached to it. Soap itself has a stranger history than most people assume. The oldest known soap recipe sits on a Babylonian clay tablet from around 2800 BCE. Water, alkali, and cassia oil. Originally used for washing wool, not skin. Egyptian papyri from 1550 BCE describe similar fat and ash mixtures. Romans, interestingly, actually preferred scraping tools called strigils over soap for most of their bathing culture. By the medieval period, soap had become a real industry, with Castile soap from Spain and Aleppo soap from Syria traded across entire regions. The actual chemistry making soap effective is elegant. Soap molecules have a water-loving head and a fat-loving tail, and that fat-loving tail latches onto the lipid coating of viruses and bacteria, letting the whole thing rinse away in water. Nobody understood this mechanism until the 20th century, but it worked the entire time regardless. If ritual washing and ancient soap already reduced disease by accident, subscribe. Because the real twist in this story isn't ancient at all. It happened in a 19th century Vienna maternity ward, and it's more disturbing than anything before it. Ignaz Semmelweis, a Hungarian physician working at Vienna General Hospital in the 1840s, noticed something inexplicable. One maternity ward, staffed by doctors coming straight from autopsies, had a childbed fever mortality rate of 10 to 15%. The other, staffed by midwives, sat around 2%. The gap was so well known that some women chose to give birth in the street rather than risk the first ward. Semmelweis suspected doctors were carrying something from the autopsy room to the delivery room on their unwashed hands. He introduced a chlorinated lime hand-washing protocol, and mortality in the first ward dropped to match the second almost immediately. He had proven hand-washing saved lives without knowing what the particles actually were. The medical establishment's response was hostility, not gratitude. Accepting his evidence meant accepting that doctors had been killing their own patients, a conclusion too uncomfortable to sit with. His protocol was dropped after he left, and he died, largely unrecognized, in a mental institution. Germ theory, developed decades later by Pasteur and Koch, finally explained the mechanism Semmelweis had stumbled onto, and medicine only rehabilitated his reputation roughly 30 years after his death. This isn't simply a story about ignorance being replaced by knowledge. It's a story about how strong evidence alone often isn't enough to change behavior when the psychological cost of accepting it is too high. Even once germ theory arrived, hospital reform came faster than population-level habit change, which required decades of public health campaigning, plus something just as important: infrastructure. Running water, soap, and clean towels weren't universally available for most of the world until relatively recently, and that gap still exists today. Current estimates suggest over 2 billion people worldwide lack access to a basic hand-washing facility with soap and water, meaning the barrier isn't knowledge at all, it's physical access. Other ancient practices worked by the same kind of accident. Fermentation creates an acidic environment that inhibits most pathogens, developed everywhere for taste and preservation, never for microbiology. But the effect was real regardless. Quarantine, from the Italian for the 40-day isolation Venice imposed on arriving ships during the Black Death, worked whether you called the cause Yersinia pestis or bad air from the east. And the effectiveness of hand-washing specifically was always uneven in a way ancient people couldn't have predicted. It interrupts fecal-oral transmission, cholera, typhoid, hepatitis A, but plague spreads through fleas, smallpox through respiratory droplets, malaria through mosquitoes. Perfect ritual hand-washing wouldn't have touched any of those, which explains a real historical puzzle. Cultures with rigorous washing rituals didn't necessarily see dramatically lower overall mortality, because most of history's biggest killers simply weren't the diseases hand-washing interrupts. Even Roman baths, often pictured as one giant communal soup, were genuinely engineered. The thermi moved water through frigidarium, tepidarium, and caldarium zones, powered by hypocaust underfloor heating and fed by serious aqueduct infrastructure. That same aqueduct network made frequent washing practical at a scale unmatched in the West until the 1800s, and its collapse partly explains the drop in medieval European hygiene, more an infrastructure story than a knowledge one. And the gap between knowing and doing hasn't closed even now. Hospital hand-washing compliance is often below 60%, even with signage everywhere and staff who understand exactly why it matters. COVID-19 produced one of the most intense hand-washing campaigns in history, and reported compliance spiked dramatically, then faded fast once the immediate threat did. So why didn't ancient people wash their hands specifically to stop disease? Because no one had the mechanism. Miasma theory pointed everyone towards smell, not contact. What they did instead, washing constantly for religion, decorum, and comfort, accidentally interrupted transmission anyway, for thousands of years, without a single person involved knowing that's what was happening. Modern medicine didn't invent hygiene. It just finally explained what all that washing had been doing the whole time.